Okay, I think we should start now. Can everyone hear me all right and see the screen? First of all, huge welcome. This is the first time we've done a Zoom for a while, so I hope all the technology works all right. It's fantastic to see some regular culture connectors and people who are brand new. Please feel free to comment. I'm very grateful for Sunette, who is moderating, and there'll be time at the end for some questions. And we've got lots of fantastic images, but I'm hoping that there will be 10 minutes at the end. I hope it's okay that we'll be recording for people who enter late and for the Culture Connect YouTube channel, people who couldn't make it. I'll be grateful if you could mute, otherwise I can mute everyone. Please relax, like Irma Stern is doing here. I'm sure you're not having your cigarette. And maybe put your phones on vibrate. I'm going to try and keep this strictly to an hour. So I'll continue very briefly with my introduction. Then Nadja will speak, the director, and then Ayesha will talk about the exciting things been happening despite COVID in education. And then it's a bit of a discussion, and then I'll finish off. So I usually do experiential tours, and been lucky enough to do 5 Irma Stern ones. One actually was going to be at the museum, but because of the student protests, it had to go to the National Gallery where there was brushing up on Stern show. Some of you may recognize the people in the image. Particularly fond of this one because this lady Ruth knew Irma Stern, had a few tales to tell. So usually with the Culture Connect, I get an expert, I get someone who's personally involved to talk. But obviously with strict lockdown, I had to go online. And UCT has come up quite a bit. Litra, you may recognize her, she did her PhD on Irma Stern and is just publishing a book about Irma Stern. She spoke about monuments along with Melanie, who's also pictured here and is based in St. James's. We did a series on brutalist architecture, so again, UCT appeared. And if you want to have a look, I can send you the link to the YouTube channel for recordings. But I want to get cracking so we can hear about the future plans. Nadja, some of you may know, she studied here and has worked here, but has also worked in the UK and France. For nearly 2 years, she was involved in the transformation portfolio for the UCT artwork collection. And she was at Zico way back too, as was Ayesha, who I had the pleasure of meeting about 7 years ago because my kids were lucky enough to go to Zonnebloem on Saturday mornings for the most fabulous art classes she did. And I'm really impressed with what she's been doing online during pandemic. So that's all for me at the moment. Over to you, Nadja.
Great, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everybody for being here. It's just so lovely to see names and faces that are recognized. So I really appreciate that you are joining us for this. Just want to share my screen here. Here we go. So I am the fortunate one who got to take over the reins this year at the Irma Stern Museum from Christopher Peter, the previous director, as many of you know, who has been 40 years with the museum. And with COVID hitting us, imagine the museum going forward. Okay, somebody, the audio seems to be on and there seems to be quite a bit of interference. Can you just check?
Okay, yeah. I heard you and then I didn't hear you. Can you try again?
Okay, I'm just saying there seems to be an audio on with somebody because there's
Okay,
quite a bit of...
I'll mute all.
Okay. She's busy. There we...
Is that better?
There we go. So hopefully you can all hear me better now. So I was just going to say that I'm very grateful to Kate and to Culture Connect for this wonderful opportunity where we can talk about how we imagine the museum going forward. Today, for me, is not so much about a specific program that we're going to take forward, but more about the look and feel of the museum that we are imagining for the future. And when I say...
Sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your screen. Ah, there you go. Right.
Now?
Yeah, it's history.
I can't see.
No, it's back to Ayesha now.
Yeah.
Let me just start a news sharing.
That's
Right. We see the house now.
Can you see the house?
Yeah. Thanks.
There we go. Okay. Now it's... Sorry. Let me just try that again. It seems to be just giving a little bit of problem. There you go. Right, there we go. Can you see the house? Fantastic. Here we go. Okay. So I was saying that this is an opportunity really to talk about the look and feel of the museum going forward, rather than the specifics around the programming going forward. And in the presentation, I speak a lot about we. So I just want to say that this is who we are. The staff team at the Irma Stern Museum. I'm top row second, and Ayesha is at the bottom row, last one there. So I want to talk to you about our vision for the look and feel and for the general approach to the museum. I mentioned Christopher Peter just now and said that he'd been 40 years at the museum. And we all remember him for his impeccable dress sense and infectious giggle around the space here. But when people hear that I'm now in the post that Christopher had, often the words are, "Ooh, what big shoes to fill." And it's something that obviously one cannot do. One cannot compete with 40 years of legacy, but also not something that I wish to do. Rather, it's for me and for the team a matter of reimagining what this museum can be going forward. At times it's a rather daunting task, as it is such a loved institution with such a long history, 50 years in 2022. And obviously one needs to be and has to be respectful of that and make sure that how one interprets the museum does not work contra to this legacy. My talk today is actually not on Irma Stern, not on her life and her art, but rather it's an engagement with the question of a museum, or the question of the Irma Stern Museum specifically, in relation to its context. What is a museum in the 21st century on the southern tip of Africa? And what is such a museum if it's placed in a university context? So let's look through that by looking at the future of the museum context. Kate said to me that most of you would be on some level familiar with the work and life of Irma Stern. And I expect that many of you also are very regular visitors to the museum. But we don't want to leave anybody behind, so I'm going to just give you a quick whirlwind synopsis of how the museum came about.
Nadja, could you speak up, please?
Okay, will do.
Thank you, or move the mic.
Okay, I moved everything a little bit closer.
Good.
The Irma Stern Museum is located on 21 Cecil Road, Rosebank. So it means that's part of the UCT Lower Campus Precinct. It consists of the large former home of the artist Irma Stern and includes a significant part of the original garden and outhouses, the old coach house, etc. The museum also houses select works by Irma Stern, so her own artworks, and a substantial collection of arts, cultural artifacts, and fantastic furniture, which Stern collected throughout her life. I want to give you a little quote here from Neville Dubois, who was the founding director of the museum, and he wrote in 1973 that Stern's approach to collecting was thus. Her taste as a collector was Catholic. An incomplete listing would include ancient Egyptian, archaic Greek, Iberian, Oriental, Central European carnival masks, religious art of several kinds, and of course, African carving. The Catholicity, I love that word, Catholicity, though, is matched by their discriminating selection. There's a common misunderstanding that the Irma Stern actually left her house and her collections in the will to be kept as a museum. That's actually not the case. In fact, the will states that she gives her house and collections in the house to further the arts, with an implication almost that the house would be sold so that the collection could be exhibited and used for the furthering of the arts. She says in her will that her collection shall be from time to time permanently or, quote, temporarily on display. So this is clearly quite different to what we have now, to the museum. And this is where the chance of history comes in. The original chair of the trustees appointed to execute Stern's will was a Mr. Clive Corder, who happened to also be a member of UCT Council. And it is he who saw the possibility of using the house as a museum for Irma Stern's work and collections, and to make this realizable through linking with the University of Cape Town. And in fact, if you think about it, this link to UCT is not far-fetched. Irma Stern lived at the base of the university for most of her life, and she was married, though ending in divorce, to Johannes Prinz, professor in German literature at UCT. Her cousins, many of her social circles, many other artists she linked with, also had links to UCT, and we have an account of a student visit. So the Irma Stern Museum was and is still formed out of an agreement between the trustees of the Irma Stern estate and UCT, where UCT purchased the house from the trust for a nominal amount, and UCT owns and maintains the property, whereas the trust owns and maintains the collection, which is then inside this property. And the collaboration extends to the committee that oversees the museum, with committee members from both UCT and the trust. The agreement was signed in 1969. Following that, there were protracted building works. And then one of these wonderful parts of history, a postal strike caused a snag in the opening of the museum because the African collection had to be identified and verified by the British Museum. And that was delayed because of this postal strike. Nevertheless, after a delay of approximately 2 years, finally, the museum opened in 1972. And now, of course, we've got this beautiful and much loved and iconic Irma Stern Museum. Which does raise the question of why should anything in the museum change? Why not run it as it has been for so many years? And the Irma Stern team is not looking here for change's sake, or of going with what is fashionable, but rather we want to consider and emphasize in what we do and how we do it, a building of a future audience for the museum, for the work of Stern, and for the arts and art history in general. And current debates around museum practice here have so much to offer in terms of making this museum a space that truly engages and addresses a diversity of visitors, and a space that meaningfully contributes to the arts and to social debates and cultural expression. So let me talk you through how the museum going forward will interpret these possibilities in terms of the Irma Stern Museum. And sometimes when one talks about how to engage with a museum, a point of starting is to not directly engage with the museum. What I mean here is the museum as a social space. So here the Irma Stern Museum has a great advantage. It's a house museum. It's got a stunning garden. And obviously being a house, being the actual house that Irma lived in, it means it was built for lingering, for socializing, and for informality. And going forward, we want to place so much more emphasis on this notion of the museum as a social space. So in the museum, we are now incorporating many more places to rest and linger, to chat, to engage with points of interest that perhaps are not core to Irma and her collection and life, but that will expose you to these nonetheless. Maybe a gardening club, maybe join us for a barista coffee, maybe come buy some Christmas gifts in the museum shop, sit on the veranda on a hot summer's day, come bring your picnic in the garden, or perhaps even host your birthday here. So I'm making the case for a museum as a spatial space, as a central tenet for the Irma Stern Museum. And I want to tell you a story to illustrate why that's for me so important. I have a friend called Svea who in 2000 visited the newly opened Tate Modern. And she came back astounded, speaking about how it was packed with all these teenagers using it as a dating site. Now, please be clear, it's not that I'm saying the Irma Stern Museum should be the dating site for the local teenagers, but rather, if you think about it, those teenagers that went to the Tate way back when in 2000 are now in their 40s. And I'm sure that many of them have lifelong memories and attachments to the Tate, and hence still visit it, and hence still support it, and through that support the arts. So imagine if the Irma Stern is the backdrop for university staff awards, is the museum where you celebrate your next birthday, or where you have your Christmas staff party, and the lifelong links that this sort of memory will form. With the feet through the door, will start a journey of exploration that might well lead to the visitor discovering Irma Stern and her art as byproduct to, let's say, a lovely picnic in the garden. Which makes socializing seem almost like a secondary thing, something that's a frivolous draw card to the museum. But I'm very passionate about seeing a social space and socializing within the museum beyond that as something that's itself very deeply important. Here, rest spots in the museum become spaces in which you can engage and relate with others in a world that so often feels alienating. This museum, with all its beauty and tranquility, can become a space of connection and healing. And let us never forget that we live in a very broken society in which it's incredibly difficult to meet with the diversity of people on an equal footing. So for me, it would be wrong to have a museum that's so full of inspiration, but that does not recognize this context that we are in. So let us make sure that the Irma Stern Museum is a site where structured as well as informal conversations can be held in an atmosphere that is so steeped in creativity that it inspires to think and engage in new ways. And in fact, we are working quite a bit with the UCT Office for Inclusivity and Change to realize and imagine projects around this way of thinking. I talk here of conversations as potentially healing and the act of making a space that encourages such conversations. And I think it's important to recognize that a contemporary museum is no longer a space of monologue, but a space of conversation and dialogue. Going to a museum should feel almost as if you are in conversation with that museum and with its offerings. So you might have to stretch yourself to learn from the museum, but similarly, the museum almost has to stretch itself too to meet you part way. Let me explain that in two ways. By the way, I understand it in two different ways. The one is the museum as a space that allows for multiple stories and entry points. And then secondly, the museum as a space that allows you to talk back to it. Let's start with the latter one, the museum as a space that allows you to talk back to it. I see my role in the museum to be a coordinator of multiple voices, of multiple stakeholders, each of which shapes and contributes to the museum. So the museum is not a case of a curator coming in with a vision or a director coming in with a vision and bringing this vision to light, but rather of my creating the opportunity for multiple voices to engage, grapple with, argue, be represented through the museum offering. An example of how practically this is currently happening in the Irma Stern Museum. We had identified from visitor feedback that recurating the African collection at the Irma Stern Museum is a priority project. So I asked one art historian from UCT, Dr. Nomusa Mukubu, who she can recommend to support us in this project. And she recommended 3 people, they recommended another 3 people, and those again recommended another 4 people. So I know a lot of you are thinking, oh, what a nightmare to organize that. But I am thinking how wonderfully exciting that is. Because of this organic process, we now have, as contributors to this recuration project, an internationally renowned scholar who's widely recognized as a leading expert in the art of the Bakongo people, members of descendant communities, an archaeologist, masters, undergraduate, and PhD students from UCT, PhD students from Indiana State University, art historians, curators, and an African language specialist. So this is, for me, an unbelievable source of knowledge that we can now draw on in realizing this project, and each participant can bring their voice to the curatorial project. So what was an interesting display of African arts becomes a rich source of scholarship as these voices speak about their understanding and appreciation of these works and their relation to Irma Stern. Further, there will be recording points in the museum which allow you as a visitor to contribute to this archive, to talk to and to talk with the museum by recording your impressions and your responses. And all of this will be available in the museum, but there will also be an online component available. The second aspect I mentioned earlier was this notion of the museum as a space that allows for multiple stories and multiple entry points. So imagine that you come into the Irma Stern Museum and all you see and hear are opinions of people that are very different to you. How much more of a chance would there be that a visitor will engage if they hear a voice or encounter a story or see an installation or so that they can directly relate to? And imagine once you have set up this relationship, is it then not much easier to do the next step and go from there and explore other voices and other ways of being and thinking? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's crucial in a museum to have multiple entry points so that your audience can find a way to relate and not leave feeling alienated. And we have had distinct instances of alienation that were recorded where people actually wrote messages in the visitor book, which spoke to this profound sense of not belonging. So central to me and central to contemporary museum praxis is this notion of multiple entry point. Again, let us think of the context in which we are. We have to recognize that distressingly a large number of South Africans will have never been encouraged to visit a museum or to engage with the arts. And here the Irma Stern Museum needs to be thought of as a place where for the first time some people from the local community, from people living close to the museum, including staff and students of UCT, can encounter a museum and encounter art. So it needs to be a space that does not alienate. I just very quickly want to give an example of how one can approach this in terms of language, just one very quick example. Now, when I say language in museums, obviously we can think about the 11 languages and which ones are represented. And that's something one can look at. In fact, I found this brochure from the museum, which sadly is not dated, but I would guess it to come from the 1980s, early 80s, maybe late 70s. And you can see here that the notion of language in museums is not a new thought. But additional to that, what register of language do we use? And this has become a very fascinating conversation within contemporary museum praxis. What language do you use that's not verbose and jargon-filled, and hence made people feel alienated? And on the flip side, is not alienatingly patronizing and dumbing down. I spoke about contemporary museums looking at this as a matter of urgency. And a lot of museums have now settled on what internationally is called the grade 6 language policy. It's felt that this language of grade 6 is adequate to communicate very complex thoughts, but is also accessible to the broadest audience. Another main point, another main tenet in contemporary museum praxis is this notion of storytelling. And how telling stories allows us to understand where we come from, gives us new lenses to engage with the here and now, and also stories form a means through which we can engage with and try to understand each other. And obviously a house museum such as Irma Stern is especially special when it comes to this, because it is the actual house the artist lived in. So one should be encouraged to imagine Irma roaming the passage, Dudley, her companion, pottering around his rooms, Irma potting plants in the garden. She was apparently a great gardener, so not a far-stretch imagination there. Charlie, the cook in the old kitchen, etc., etc. And I want to just quickly show you a range of slides of Irma Stern's museum throughout a few years, from when she lived there to beyond. I love the continuity that these slides show. And how when you go into the museum now, you still see so many aspects of the studio, just as they were when she lived there. Through the discreet use of technology, carefully integrated to not become eyesores, information such as this will become available in the museum. So what I'm saying is that going forward, the elements of how Irma Stern lived here will be incorporated much more in the museum. And this is not necessarily a matter of getting her bed back to where it was from the Koopmans de Wethuis in Tulbach, not the Koopmans de Wethuis, that one's in Cape Town. But rather it's a matter of returning the space to the way Irma would have had it in some select areas. And here the slide shows it rather lovely. On the one side, we've got how Irma had it and how it's now. So in select areas, having the house back to what Irma would have had it, and through that to speak to the wider social and art history. So we can explore the context in which she traveled. We include information on the history of the site, information on other people who share the space with Irma Stern, whether it's Dudley Welch, Charlie the cook, Assa the washwoman, Noel Kemper, other social and political relations, etc. Just to tell you about a little project that I have been busy with in the last weeks. We stripped back the colors of walls to see what colors would have been there when the house was first built. So going back to the 1830s, when this was a rambling thatch roof farmhouse situated in vineyards, and part of that is still preserved in the current house. Then when John Parker, who was architect and later mayor of Cape Town, renovated the house after he bought it in 1898, then when Irma Stern lived and worked here. So what I'm trying to say is that bringing back these sort of elements is for me personally hugely exciting, but also points to the depth of history on this site. Another example that I love is how the window glass in Irma's old studio has scratched into it, Roseberry 1895. It's a little memento left by the daughter of a previous owner. The Irma Stern Museum obviously is a place to celebrate the glorious inventiveness and opulence of Irma Stern as an artist. And it is through making these minutiae of her life and character and contexts come alive that we understand history on a more visceral level, through telling complex stories of all the contradictions and all the messiness. And I think let us not shy away from the fact that Irma Stern's life and thought was complex and messy. Sadly, so much writing and speaking about Stern has insisted on reducing her to almost like a one-dimensional character. So you get sort of these tropes of Irma the racist, or Irma the sex-starved woman, or Irma the genius. But her life and her story and her collections are so much more interesting than that. I want to just illustrate that by looking at the complexity of Irma Stern's lived experience, just in a brief sort of little synopsis, to show the interesting complexity of this artist. Irma Stern was a Jew who grew up among profound anti-Semitism and who lost relatives to the concentration camps of the Third Reich. Although a Jew, she was not practicing, but she nonetheless deeply identified in her 30s with Jewishness, Zion, and the Jewish art movement. And let us not forget that exile and war were regular companions in her life. So Irma Stern's father, Samuel, for instance, was arrested during the South African War by the British forces for being a Boer collaborator and was imprisoned. And the rest of the family lived, in effect, as refugees in Cape Town. Living in Berlin during the First World War meant that she witnessed the hard conditions and turmoil at first hand. And then with the Second World War, Irma had to again deal with war, fleeing to South Africa, and also shunning Germany, the German language, old German friends, and the German gallerist during these war years. Some of you might even know that her former gallery was itself implicated in war art crimes. And then later, in South Africa in turn, her life was lived against the backdrop of socio-political upheaval in South Africa. Many of you obviously know these biographical details, but what I'm hoping to illustrate is the richness and complexity of this artist's experience and psychology. And through this rich tapestry of experiences, it then becomes so interesting to investigate Irma Stern's relation to Africa, a continent she barely knew actually before she settled here in 1920 at the age of 26. If you think about it, she spent 17 of her formative years in Europe and 9 in South Africa. So the question of how does one in South Africa 2020 position a woman who saw the West as a spent, degenerate and viable force and embraces a romantic celebration, appreciation, and yet also an exoticization of Africanness. I strongly believe that Irma Stern becomes the more interesting, the more one engages with these complexities. Not only more interesting, more relevant as a lodestone against which one can reflect on the crucial conversations of the now. And I think we are incredibly lucky in that currently many prominent scholars are researching and writing on Irma Stern, and we are reaching out to them to include their valuable voices. I mentioned research, and I think it's very important to always recognize that the museum also forms part of the University of Cape Town. And that, of course, raises all kinds of wonderful opportunities to use the museum as a foil to speak to current debates. And in this vein, we have already hosted students from the UCT Photography Department earlier this year. We are working with students from the UCT Congolese Society, curatorial students, using the Irma Stern Museum as a reflection point in a course on the politics of representation. As a side note, I just want to mention how proud we also are of our curator of the Irma Stern collection, Kathy Wheeler. She just completed her PhD. Congratulations, Kathy. But she used the Irma Stern as a case study. And I think this shows how important the museum can be as a pedagogic tool. It's something that Ayesha will pick on just now when she speaks about the new education project. So I've told you so many theoretical things that we hope to realize, draw on in the museum, but of course these will find very practical expression in what the museum looks and feels like. A rethought street facade, a new reception, garden tables, a permanent education space, a range of booklets, each of which speaks about facets of the artist's collection and house. Easier access to research on Irma Stern and her African collection through research areas and online material, newly curated spaces. Venue availability for university and private hire. And of course then the social aspect I spoke about with a museum shop, a barista at times, etc. And of course, 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the museum. So watch this space. But in the meantime, in 2021, we will already see, for instance, a recurated African art collection. And also in 2021, we are lucky to host an exhibition curated by Michael Godby that will be installed throughout the museum with a focus on Irma Stern's nudes. Many of you will know Michael and are familiar with his rigorous research. And we very much look forward to seeing how he combines old favorites with seldomly seen work dug out of storage drawers. And we look forward to the catalogue that will accompany the exhibition. But we do need your help in all of this. We need you to follow the museum on social media, to encourage your friends and family to visit once we are open, to join us for events and discussions, and indeed, to give us your feedback. And I want to now hand over to Ayesha so that she can talk to you about our new website and the wonderful outreach education project that she has been busy implementing. Over to you, Ayesha.
Thank you very much, Nadja. And welcome to everyone and hello. I'm going to just roughly speak through the education situation at the museum currently, and then also our moves towards a digital interfacing for the museum. Understanding what it means to be human, to belong and be understood, to gain insight into our commonalities and share our stories is really integral to the work of a museum. To create opportunities to make sense of the human experience and condition And to work with precious human material is a great responsibility that museums bear. It is a noble task and a very humbling one. Within the context of the disparate conditions in which our people live, our people as in our visitor constituency, opportunities for the sharing of our vastly different knowledges in a very meaningful way, in a non-threatening space, and in the language that comes easiest is a very difficult task. It requires collaboration and consultation across many levels. It requires conversations that get us to learn, experience, make, debate, and engage. Conversations that create shared experiences and new histories. Conversations that bring change. Now, these transformative experiences are like being asked to draw in public, when making that initial mark on a crisp white blank paper is hard enough to do in private. So this task requires careful consideration of what we do and how we do it in order to build a future audience for the museum, a future audience for the work of Irma Stern and for the arts and art history in general. The Irma Stern Museum Education Project aims to develop, implement, and share, where am I now? To share and learn a space filled with memories and manifestations of a creative spirit. A real human social space which is inclusive, welcoming, and accessible to a transforming community of existing and potential art lovers. To create a space where you can look slowly, talk easily, and create freely. So our task is to encourage public engagement with our museum and develop engaging visitor programs. To develop relevant education materials that create interest and facilitate wide learning around Irma Stern. We need to forge excellent working relationships between the museum and our partners in education. And these relationships shouldn't be selfish. They shouldn't be just for our benefit. It needs to benefit and improve the quality of learning at all the institutions involved. We want to provide quality visual arts education services to school groups, focusing on access to previously marginalized groups and areas that have historically experienced underinvestment. And to do so, these programs need to be developed in consultation with participating individuals, institutions, and communities. So we create opportunities to share knowledge, to create chances for educator development and curriculum support. In my personal view, I don't separate art education and life. Life is about education and about growth, and learning cannot fall outside of life. Our current education systems are not serving our humanity or benefiting the lives of the majority in their current form. Learning tends to be static and standardized, and play isn't recognized as research. There's no time to imagine, no time to wonder. Schoolwork is disparate from children's realities. And in the meantime, art is all of our first language. Yet children are not sensitized to the barrage of images they consume or are confronted with daily. Education should be about making sense of the world and finding your place in it, adjusting where necessary. So our pedagogy should align with a vision for humanity, our vision for a shared existence. But first of all, we need safe spaces in which we feel free to imagine. For many public schools, creative components in the curriculum are sidelined. There's great constraints around resources, be it human resources, materials, budgets, and time. Plus the logistics and bureaucratic requirements for excursions during contact teaching time is even more constrained. But the crunch is that the value of art's role in an ever-changing society is not fully understood. During my time at the Iziko National Gallery, I was informed many times by teachers upon invitation to come and visit that art is not for us. The notion that engagement with art and art spaces is alienating and elitist is very pervasive. I may as well ask teachers to draw in public. but there is nothing quite like hosting a group of people in an art museum. It is possibly the best conciliatory human experience I have had. Encounters with the evidence of the way humans channel thought and feeling through brushstrokes, individual artworks, and curated collections. Those encounters are priceless. For a child who lives only within a 20-kilometer radius, traveling by bus to learn about life out in the world is priceless. To navigate a new space, to be present and welcome there is priceless. To have your opinion heard and valued as a young person is priceless. It is a learning experience that really can't be measured. And by the time an initial school excursion is done and kids have to board a bus and get back home with their heads and hearts full, it's often those very, very same teachers who displayed such guardedness initially that are asking to be put on a waiting list for a bus for the next visit. So I truly believe that the greatest role art can play in society is as a tool for learning and living. It is at once a highly individualized and yet cooperative and collaborative experience. It allows for critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication at once. Art is at once our first language and our superpower. In a digital and visual world, visual literacy is an essential skill. And currently in a world regulated by a pandemic, we are now faced with even more considerations around what we do and how we do it without visitors. So we are currently developing digital education programs and products, online teaching and learning methodologies to further our educational aims in the context of physical distancing and remote learning. And this project forms part of strategic and pedagogic investigations into best practice for the museum. With the museum closed to all, a virtual education plan has been developed to ensure that our collections and services are still relevant, beneficial, and visible to the schooling community. For that purpose, we are focused on supporting the grade 12 curriculum during this time as learners prepare for their exit levels in the visual art exams for 2020. And that visual exam is happening on the 15th of December this year. We also understand that most learners do not have access to sufficient data to attend virtual lessons. And this is a major problem, whereas previously with visits, transport, it costs about between 4,000 and 6,000 Rand for a school bus, just for one museum trip. And these days we are stuck with the idea that people do not have devices or access to data. And here I'm not only including those learners who are working from home, I'm including schools, classroom situations where access to virtual learning is quite a problem. So what we've done is we've created a scaffolding approach to our resource material. This includes black and white printable notes and activity sheets, PowerPoint presentations, voice notes, videos, which teachers can download and print, present in class, or distribute them using thumb drives or WhatsApp. The material that we have been developing has been developed in collaboration with South Peninsula High School in Deep River through a curriculum support program. So the museum presented a series of lessons, notes, and worksheets to the grade 12 visual art learners, focusing on the standard national curriculum, which we commonly refer to as the CAPS curriculum, the curriculum assessment policy statements, quite bureaucratic there. And what we've done is we've looked very, very carefully at that grade 12 curriculum and isolated the modules that feature Irma quite strongly and delved into many topics in order to answer the question, what is art? So by exploring Irma's responses to a changing world around her, in order to make sense of this changing world around us, we need to be employing our art senses as she did by contributing to the creation of meaning. Through Irma's journey, we could reflect and explore the importance of creating an individual visual language, developing an eye and our own visual literacy skills, We looked at the emergence of a Cape Town art world and art society, juxtaposing Irma's artworks with works by Edward Roworth, Peter Clark, Jared Sokoto, in an effort to equip learners with the skills to at once analyze artwork and to cover curriculum content at the same time. Because learners' time, the contact time is very, very short. Just to put a few things perhaps into context through the observations that I've had through this teaching practice in this time of COVID and remote learning. Learners have to learn online. They need to maintain physical distancing or virtual relationships. It's almost impossible to undertake group projects or interactive learning, as much of the social aspect that primarily aids our development as humans is impossible. These young people are suffering from content overload and fatigue from a barrage of highly visual information in their daily lives, as social media just starts ruling our world and the kind of fear mongering that happens through the media. But yet they are not visually literate enough to filter or discern this kind of information. So we have a generation that's angst-ridden. They're immobilized, they're quite unsure of their futures. The impact of COVID on our social fabric is not discussed or included at school, except with regard to immediate safety precautions. And this takes its toll on the psyche of an entire generation, especially on those who already have to work so much harder to attain the security of a privileged life, if at all. So our learning time was really cut in half, and we had to make the best of the situation. So this kind of learning really allowed us to try and develop skills, to analyze artworks, to have conversations, and cover curriculum at the same time. And the beauty of it all was that Irma allowed us to simultaneously investigate world events, different art genres, be it European modernism, and even the practice and production of visual art on our own continent at the same time. So it was really a great learning curve as a seasoned museum and art educator, where materials development has always primarily been supplemented by encounters with people, artwork, and space within the museum. So you always hope that your resources live on as a source of information and inspiration after your encounter with young people. But the power of the museum site, the presence of a curated tactile collection, and human interaction is where the potent learning really takes place. So going forward, what we've been looking at is what during this experience of teaching during the time of COVID, can we really offer the youth of South Africa, especially those that are now heading towards their final exit exams. And what we've developed here, and what we're in the process of developing through consultation and review with partnering schools, educators, the education department, etc., is looking at actually building up the visual literacy building blocks, discussing art in a very meaningful way in a language that is accessible, focusing on the idea of visual analysis and visual literacy skills, how to read an artwork, how to compare an artwork, how to talk about an artwork, how to have a conversation, slowing people down so that they actually get to talk about art and then also learn the art of conversation and compromise and empathy. We've also discovered that while people are being flooded with images, learners still have not been exposed to a wide enough variety of artwork in order to grasp historical, cultural, or political context, or understand the concept of style and influence. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you to our lovely, lovely new website, which in this time will become our digital interface. It's a way to digitally package our museum and what we do. And very selfishly, I'm going to start off with our education page because I think that's just a nice flow and I'm quite proud of what we've done. It's still a work in progress. as we continually review and consult with all our shareholders and our people that we really need to work with. This website will be launched during Heritage Month with a press campaign, so please look out for that. And what you see here right now is a way to sort of engage with young people, engage with schools, with teachers, with classrooms, so that we can continue to be of service and do our work during this time. We're going to very much broaden what we have. I'm going to show you the one page right now. That will just be our introduction. And what we decided to start off with, as I did identify, was the idea of visual analysis, and especially how to analyze an unseen artwork. Simply because the skills that you use to analyze an unseen artwork, whether it's in an exam, etc., or in a classroom, is also because we encounter these images on the streets, in the galleries, on social media every day. And it's a way just to look at an artwork slowly that can really help you to kind of discern for yourself or to discover a meaning that comes from your own personal experience. So when we look at this, we just have our basic introductions here. We also have specific notes for the teacher. I'll click on that later. I want to just navigate this page for you. We've been working with a brand strategist and web designer called Anne Morgendrath, who really has become part of our team and is brave enough to have the conversations that we need to have around the representations of ourselves and what we stand for. Also realizing that we are an organization and a museum in transition, and not to shy away from the fact that we're still learning and to be examples of avid learners for life. So we have videos. Our lovely Anne has insisted that I do face-to-face videos to really relax people for introductions. We have discussions, we have resource materials. And the reason we started off with a very simple image is just so that you tend to look deeper when you think that you have nothing to say around images such as these. I'm going to encourage you that the minute this hits the World Wide Web and is open for public viewing, please go and have a look and explore this further. To really give you a sense of what Anne has done in collaboration with all of us, this is our homepage, the aesthetic of which I think is absolutely fantastic. It's really clear, it's contemporary, but it doesn't detract from what we really stand for. We have our home, our story, under which you can have a look and see who the team is, a bit of history. We've got a lovely timeline. You can explore our collections. So there's quite a bit of information. I think I'm going to stop now because I see we only have quite a few minutes left for questions. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you both. I must say my heart and my mind is full, particularly those images of Irma I never seen before.